The last time I was ever in Borders, you kids probably don't remember Borders. It was like Barnes & Noble, but somehow not. It was the other major book retailer, and I always remember, obviously they both started with B, that the two were kind of indistinguishable from each other. The last time I was in a Borders, they were having their going out of business sale, and stuff was like 75% off. And I was, 20 or so at the time, and being a broke college student, spending anything more than $20 was like a big outing for me. And I think I spent about $30 on books that would have normally cost something like $80 brand new. And so the three books that I got were the Library of America's collection of Raymond Carver short stories. Good purchase. Still have it. It is technically 3 states away from me right now. The second was the Letters of Allen Ginsberg, the collected letters of Allen Ginsberg. I was very much in my Bob Dylan era and reading a lot of the beats that had inspired him. I'll talk more about beats throughout this video. And then lastly, the book that I got was this little guy called Said the Shotgun to the Head by Saul Williams. And Saul Williams is like IDK, if not one of, then the most famous slam poet. And of course, slam poetry now is understood more as a caricature of itself. The slam poet voice and whatnot. But Saul Williams actually has an exuberant enough vocabulary and imagination to make slam poetry or just his poetry respectable. Certainly, I think this book and its topography lend itself to that. This book could be categorized as, I think, what the kids were calling new sincerity at the time. I don't know if anyone talks about new sincerity anymore. Now they probably just consider it millennial cringe, right? It was one of those books that advertised itself as being, of a post 9/11 world, without really specifically being about 9/11 or even generally being about it. But that's what you had to do to sell books in 2003 when I think this came out. What is this book about? Very simply, it is a love poem. It's both a love poem and a profession of faith. I think a fair summation of this poem is that the poet is falling in love with the divine feminine aspect of God and having it reawaken a faith that is worth proselytizing about. And the love poems that you read as a young man tend to have real staying power, whether they're cringy or not. They tend to be candles in the dark. And my God, why is it always dark? Why does it never get to be morning for a good boy like me? This book is a candle in the dark for me, not just because, it's been there for me in bad times, but because, probably more importantly, it led me to even better shit. I mostly remember snippets from Williams's poem, and when I return to it, I usually only read a couple pages at a time. It has, however, led me directly to one of my favorite authors of all time, Eduardo Galeano, which I read a new Galeano recently, and I'll talk about that in this video. And it also led me to beat poet Bob Kaufman, who I've always been aware of. I've read some of his poems here and there, but I've never read a whole collection of his until now. And that's what I want to talk about today, both someone newer to me and an old favorite. So first I want to start right off with the beginning of Williams's poem, and it begins like this. Citizens, children of the night, bearers of the day torch, scorched and burned, burn not. The dam is broken, the curse is fled, once muddied and still, the river runs red. All those ships that never sailed, the ones with their sea cocks open, that were scuttled in their stalls, today I bring them back, huge and intransitory, and let them sail forever. So that second page, that all those ships that never sailed, that is a direct quote. That is the very first stanza of a Bob Kaufman poem. In fact, it is the first stanza of the poem that broke Bob Kaufman's, highly mythologized, or maybe it was real, highly mythologized, 10-year vow of silence. This is something that Williams talks about in the acknowledgments of the book, and Kaufman is said to have taken a vow of silence after the assassination of JFK, and it lasted for 10 more years through the end of the Vietnam War. Like I said, that is a little bit of a, mythologized. It's a little mythologized of what's actually going on. I watched a documentary recently about Bob Kaufman called "And When I'm Dead, I Won't Stay Dead," and the people in that documentary were saying, well, it wasn't so cut and dried as that. He had actually gone through some electroshock therapy in 1963, and that had, been as much a contributing factor as anything else. But that also he would just say hello to, he lived in San Francisco, and he would say hello to people on the street in those years. And he would be talking. It's just that he didn't publish for about 10 years. And that poem does show up in the collection, The Ancient Rain, which is the collection that I read. There's part 1, and that all is poems from before 1963, and then part 2 starts off with this poem. So I want to read that poem in its entirety now. All those ships that never sailed, the ones with their sea cocks open, that were scuttled in their stalls, today I bring them back, huge and intransitory, and let them sail forever. All those flowers that you never grew, that you wanted to grow, the ones that were plowed underground in the mud, today I bring them back, and let you grow them forever. All those wars and truces, dancing down these years, all in 3 flag-swept days rejected meaning of God, my body, once covered with beauty, is now a museum of betrayal. This part remembered because of that one's touch, this part remembered for that one's kiss. Today, I bring it back and let you live forever. I breathe a breathless I love you and move you forever. Remove the snake from Moses' arm, and someday the Jewish queen will dance down the street with the dogs and make every Jew her lover. And there are some basic themes that show up in that poem that obviously lit a spark in Williams. If you were going to describe what Said the Shotgun to the Head is about, it's about the poem speaker's newfound belief in God that is primarily romantic and ecstatic. God is a woman, and Williams is in love with her, and God is in every person, and romantic love is possible with everyone. It's, fusing religious faith with romantic love that's often polyamorous. And like I said, it comes with this sort of certain new sincerity aspect, or slam poet millennial cringe, but it is shameless in its relentless optimism, and I think it does far more good with that. Here, let me read you a sampling, a bit better of a sampling of what Williams's poem is about. This comes from part 2, which is actually part 9 because he counts down 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, and I'll just read that now. Most beloved, I am certain of nothing more than your existence. 1,000 ants crawling under a log may find themselves exposed in my childlike search for you. I have spent lifetimes in monasteries and drum-stretched villages in expectation of this, our ecstatic dance. My Kali flower, I am eternally destroyed by your love. No longer am I eligible for any worker's pension. My friends laugh at me and talk behind my back. They say that you have changed me, and I am. I am like a survivor of the flood, walking through the streets drenched with God. Surprised that all of the drowned victims are still walking and talking. Maybe there's hope. I rush to each victim's side, sucking what I can of you out of your various incarnations, pumping their stomachs and filling them. To touch them is to touch you. To kiss them is to kiss you. My friends, love is an art form slightly removed from its element. One may ask, well, what does that mean? I respond, I've made it up. But it shall be from now on. From now on, cities will be built on one side of the street, so that soothsayers will have wilderness to wander, and lovers space enough to contemplate a kiss. She kissed as if she alone could forge the signature of the sun. Both poems are doing something profane and holy at the same time. You can say there are elements of polyamorous love going on in both. But going back to Kaufman, people say this a lot about poetry, but I do think you have to read aloud as much of Kaufman's poetry as possible. And Kaufman does sound like kind of a proto-slam poet. And it's a good exercise, I think, reading his poems aloud and working past or around what I feel in me is that kind of knee-jerk reaction to, oh, this is slam poetry voice, cringe. A good example of this kind of, anachronistic sort of present voice creeping into Kaufman's poetry comes from the title poem, The Ancient Rain. I'm going to be reading a lot of poems directly in this video, and I want to see if you pick up what I also heard, because some of these sound a little contemporary given, well, we'll just read this one little part. The ancient rain shall bring death to those who love and feel only themselves. The ancient rain is all colors, all shapes, all sizes. The ancient rain is a mystery known only to itself. The ancient rain filled the seas. Ancient rain. Some stay dry while others feel the pain. Okay, it sounds like Chocolate Rain, guys. Just a little bit, not entirely, and I am pulling out a selected version. But I read that and I was like, oh my god, did Tay Zonday read this? Sometimes you read older poetry and you accidentally hear modern stuff that is got its own context. I do think the whole poem is not as cheesy as that. The whole poem, The Ancient Rain. At times it, gets more into just straight up prose or a speech or a monologue almost. It's several pages, so I don't have time to read the whole thing, but I do really recommend it along with the rest of this collection. The collection encompasses work, as I said, on either side of this famed vow of silence. And I wouldn't say one is stronger than the other. At times, he has this very symbolist, like Rimbaud aspect of the beats that is fused with contemporary consumer culture of mid-century America. At other times, he feels like a ruthless journalism of the sensory experience, mediated through the pop culture lingua franca of the time. He does feel by turns surprisingly contemporary and at other turns a bit quaint. By all accounts, he led a really, really rough life. As I said, electroshock therapy. And his poetry reflects that, but it also reflects the bursting energy of the soul of an artist. Someone who is alive with poetry inside them, and he's just felt like another candle in the dark to me recently. I am a camera. The poet, nailed on the hard bone of this world, his soul dedicated to silence, is a fish with frog's eyes. The blood of a poet flows out with his poems, back to the pyramid of bones from which he is thrust. His death is a saving grace. Creation is perfect. He's a writer that's not afraid or ashamed to be playful. He has a lot of poems that really are more oral exercises than primarily full of meaning. At worst, it can be said that there is pleasure in the pronunciation of such rich vocabulary. And I want to read one more poem of Kaufman's, and then I'll move on to Galeano. War Memoir. Jazz. Don't listen to it at your own risk. In the beginning, in the wet, warm, dark place, straining to break out, clawing its strange cables, hearing her screams, laughing. Later, we forget ourselves. We didn't know. Some secret jazz shouted, "Wait, don't go." Impatient, we came running, innocent, laughing blobs of blood and faith to this mother-father world where laughter seems out of place. So we learned to cry. Pleased, they pronounced human. The secret jazz blew a sigh. Some familiar sound shouted, "Wait, some are evil, some will hate." Just jazz, blowing its top again. So we rushed and laughed as we pushed and grabbed, while jazz blew in the night. Suddenly, we were too busy to hear a sound. We were busy shoving mud in men's mouths, who were busy dying on living ground, busy earning medals for killing children on deserted street corners, occupying their fathers, raping their mothers. Busy humans were busy burning Japanese in Atomicolor cinescope with stereophonic screams. What 100% red-blooded savage would waste precious time listening to jazz, with so many important things going on? But even the fittest murderers must rest, so we sat down on our blood-soaked garments and listened to jazz, lost, steeped in all our dreams. We were shocked at the sound of life, long gone from our own. We were indignant at the whistling, thinking, singing, beating, swinging living sound, which mocked us, but let us feel sweet life again. We wept for it, hugged, kissed it, loved it, joined it, we drank it, smoked it, ate with it, slept with it. We made our girls wear it for lovemaking instead of silly lace gowns. Now, in these terrible moments, when the dark memories come, the secret moments to which we admit no one, when guiltily we crawl back in time, reaching away from ourselves, we hear a familiar sound. Jazz. Scratching, digging, bluing, swinging jazz. And we listen. And we feel. And we live. I thought that poem would be the best transition into talking about a book I read recently of Eduardo Galeano's This is Days and Nights of Love and War, because that poem is about, desperate lives and the sort of candles in the dark that, desperate people in desperate situations hold around in their hearts, whether it be jazz or whether, in my case, it be a Eduardo Galeano book. One of the epigraphs in Williams's "Said the Shotgun to the Head," to return to that for a moment, was, of course, from the Book of Embraces, which I've done a separate video on. You should check it out. And the Book of Embraces is kind of, I would say, a spiritual sequel to this book. But that epigraph goes, or that line goes, "I can't sleep. There's a woman stuck between my eyelids. I'd tell her to get out if I could, but there's a woman caught in my throat." Isn't that beautiful? It never stops being beautiful to me. As I said, I've talked about Galeano in that book specifically, and you should check it out. And the reason I really, really love Eduardo Galeano is this sense of deep human connection that underpins all his work, and how even from his more extreme situations that he lived through in his extreme life, I felt like he was always a guy that could speak to moments in my life. Oftentimes his are in much stronger and realer terms. I felt that he evokes an actual history. Feels like I'm living through a pseudo-history, a farcical history. Galeano's life actually had stakes, and he had actually written something worthy of getting put on a death squad list. I don't want to speak too much for myself, but I ain't done shit. I ain't written anything that's going to get me on a death squad list, not yet. All I do is make YouTube videos on obscure writers and such. Though that would be very befitting of this administration if, like, their Grok AI or whatever who's making decisions started pulling out and wanting to punish obscure YouTubers. I mean, that's just, you gotta chalk that up to luck of the draw. It ain't because I had numbers or, did actual influence. Galeano, for me, to return to the points, is one of the most important writers in the world. Certainly, the most important contemporary non-English writer to me, I think. Why is that? Well, let's take page 99. He seems to be talking about fellow writer Rodolfo Walsh, who was an Argentine writer or mentor of his. And I just want to read this brief scene. That day, I opened the window and the blinds without being asked, and the blast of daylight almost killed him. We cursed each other out for a good while. I offered to bring him some bats to complete the atmosphere. I told him jokes and political gossip, which he liked, while he grumbled about the heat or the cold or the light, and I finally got a smile out of him. We discussed, as usual, in the slow and lethargic way he discusses, why I don't think man was and will be worthless, and why I don't join him when he invites me along on his journey to the bottom of the pit of hopelessness. I can't fool around with any of this. If I let myself fall in, I'll stay there. I can't caress death without entering it. I think this quote gets at best what I like about Galeano. He's an optimist, and he's a stalwart optimist, I would say, even though death and destruction of his friends and way of life are all around him. But he's also keenly aware of the seductive of how seductive hopelessness is for him. Being an optimist doesn't mean you're impervious to hopelessness. It means you're constantly at war with it. Optimism isn't a way of feeling, it's an orientation to the world. So what is this book actually about? This book is like a memoir / poeticized or fictionalized history of Galeano's life over the course of 3 years from 1973 to 1976. This was taking place during Operation Condor, which was, when the U.S. was helping aid a lot of different right-wing dictatorial governments in South America, taking over. The most famous one most Americans know about is the Chilean coup, the Pinochet coup. But that same year, in 1973, there was a coup in Uruguay, which is where Eduardo Galeano's from. And he found out his name was on a list, so he escaped over the river to Argentina. And he at the time worked for Crisis Magazine, which was, a leftist journalist outlet. And they continued to work in Argentina. But of course, he was exiled from his home. Then in 1976, there was a coup in Argentina. And again, his name was on a list. And I had to flee to Spain. He went to Europe after that. But this book is about like that whole period in his life, and it is about a lot of his friends and a lot of fellow leftists and a lot of journalists and artists who are living and dying and being disappeared by the authoritarian governments. I think in Argentina there were like 30,000 people that were just disappeared and were gone forever. Like their bodies were gone. And I very intentionally read this book right now, or within the last couple of months. I don't want to like draw too much of a parallel to my own life, but it felt comforting to read a novel or a book that was sort of constantly under siege to, you know, a rapid fire authoritarian government, kind of moving and disappearing people. Again, gotta stress, Galeano's life, actual stakes. My life, it's a much more drastic headspace than where I'm at. But of course, that's every book that I read. And reading something like this with actual stakes keeps me grounded. Here's another passage that met me where I was at. Political activism didn't help me, although more than once, coated from head to toe with poster glue, I felt happily weary or a sense of combat which was worthwhile. Around me existed a quiet, tamed world in which each citizen represented his character. Some had a complete cast, and Pavlov's little dog salivated punctually. Several times I tried to write. Instinct told me this could be the way to get rid of the beast that had grown inside of me. I wrote a word, a sentence sometimes, and then I would scratch it out. After some weeks or months, the page was completely scratched up, and it quietly rested in its place on the table, saying nothing. And that's kind of where I'm at these days. Emotionally spent, often overcome with a sense of futility in both art and politics, looking at a tamed world. But Galeano did end up writing a lot more after this period in his life, and politics did end up shifting after a long while. The Book of Embraces is, like I said, the spiritual sequel to this book. That was published in the early 90s, shortly after the Uruguayan dictatorship fell. And so even though this is a melancholic and tragic story, or series of stories, I was guided by the light at the end of the tunnel, by that candle in the dark. And I was encouraged, as always, by the deep humanism that is possible and even inevitable in response to man's depravity. I'm writing and participating in a lot of political activism these days, but there's definitely a disconnect, a sense of futility, almost a dissociation. But I learned a long time ago that faith isn't moving with the fervor of certainty. It is moving in uncertainty. It's running on empty with no guarantees. Whatever your faith is, it's only ever as big as a candle in the dark. And that's what Eduardo Galeano will always be for me. That's what Saul Williams will be for me, and that's what Bob Kaufman will be for me.
Más de 10 años de soledad en el calabozo. Y tuvimos 7 años sin leer un libro. Y tuvimos mucho tiempo para pensar. Y descubrimos esto. O logras ser feliz con poco y liviano de equipaje, porque la felicidad está dentro tuyo, o no logras nada. Es tan notable la constitución de nuestra naturaleza que terminas aprendiendo mucho más del dolor que de la bonanza. Esto no quiere decir que recomiendo el camino del dolor y ni nada por el estilo. quiere decir que le quiero transmitir a la gente que se puede caer y volverse a levantar. Y siempre vale la pena volver a empezar una y mil veces mientras uno esté vivo. Ese es el mensaje más grande de la vida. Que se puede resumir en esto: derrotados son los que dejan de luchar. Y dejar de luchar es dejar de soñar. Luchar, soñar y andar contra el suelo, chocando con la realidad, son el sentido que tiene la existencia y el conformar la vida.